Hello, seniors! I'm glad that you are able to view this instructional video and that proves you are interested to learn research. May this video provide you with memorable learning as you go through Practical Research 1. Happy learning! Our lesson today is Data Gathering Instruments. At the end of this module, you are expected to distinguish appropriate data gathering instrument for qualitative research, plan appropriate data gathering instruments for qualitative research, formulate qualitative research instruments, and validate the research instrument of qualitative research. The data gathering instrument is an important step in the research process. The instrument you choose to collect the data will depend on the type of data you plan on collecting and how you plan to collect it. Data gathering instruments for qualitative research means open-ended questionnaires, interviews, observation, or any other forms which are used to collect information. That is according to Jones in 1985. Let's look at three of the most used data gathering or data collecting instruments in more detail. Let's start with qualitative questionnaires. Qualitative questionnaires attempt to elicit more in-depth responses and are usually designed to find out what has changed as a result of the program, what the mentees have learned, and what they are doing differently. Answers obtained to open-ended questionnaire questions are analyzed using qualitative methods, and they involve discussions and critical analysis without the use of numbers and calculations. Questionnaires have many uses, most notably to discover what the masses are thinking. These include market research, political polling, customer service feedback, evaluations, opinion polls, and social science research, according to Ollie Ray in 2014. Let's move on to the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative questionnaires. O'Leary in 2014 suggests some obvious strengths for this research method, as administering a questionnaire allows the researcher to generate data specific to their own research and offers insights that might otherwise be unavailable. In listing the additional benefits of questionnaires, he suggests that they can reach a large number of respondents, represent an even larger population, allow for comparisons, generate qualitative data through the use of open-ended questions, and be confidential and even anonymous. For the weaknesses, he offers some concerns in using questionnaires as a research tool, as they are time-consuming, expensive, and the sampling is difficult. He asserts that questionnaires are notoriously difficult to get right and they often do not go as planned. The second type of data gathering instrument is an interview. An interview is a conversation for gathering information. A research interview involves an interviewer who coordinates the process of the conversation and asks questions, and an interviewee who responds to those questions. Interviews can be conducted face-to-face or over the telephone. The internet is also emerging as a tool for interviewing. The interview is an appropriate method when there is a need to collect in-depth information on people's opinions, thoughts, experiences, and feelings. Interviews are useful when the topic of inquiry relates to issues that relate or require complex questioning and considerable probing. Face-to-face interviews are suitable when your target population can communicate through face-to-face conversations better than they can communicate through writing or phone conversations. Examples are children, elderly, or disabled individuals as your respondents. Interviews can be designed differently depending on the needs being addressed in the information. So we have these types of qualitative interviews. First is the semi-structured interviews. In a semi-structured interview, the interviewer uses a set of predetermined questions, and the respondents answer in their own words. Some interviewers use a topic guide that serves as a checklist to ensure that all respondents provide information on the same topics. The interviewer can probe areas based on the respondents' answers or ask supplementary questions for clarification. Semi-structured interviews are useful when there is a need to collect in-depth information in a systematic manner from a number of respondents or interviewees, such as teachers and community leaders. Second type of qualitative interview is unstructured interviews. In an unstructured interview, the interviewer has no specific guidelines, restrictions, predetermined questions, or a list of options. The interviewer asks a few broad questions to engage the respondent in an open, informal, and spontaneous discussion. The interviewer also probes with further questions and/or explores inconsistencies to gather more in-depth information on the topic. Unstructured interviews are particularly useful for getting the stories behind respondents' experiences or when there is little information about the topic. Let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of interviews. For the strengths, interviews provide useful information when participants cannot be directly observed. The interviewer has better control over the types of information that they received, and if worded effectively, questions will encourage unbiased and truthful answers. For the weaknesses, it can be time-consuming and the inexperienced interviewers may not be able to keep the questions properly focused, and the interview answers may be deceptive because the interviewee tries to respond in a way that will please the interviewer, and the equipment may be a problem because it can be costly in the part of the interviewer. Third type is observation. The observation is a systematic data collecting technique that involves watching individuals in their natural environment or a naturally occurring situation. The processes under observation are normal and not contrived. They can range from individual cases to groups and whole communities. They provide highly detailed information about natural processes. The data collection is laborious and time-consuming and may have to be repeated to ensure reliability. However, observation schedules based on a set of expectations can make data collection easier. But what is an observation? It is a way to gather data by watching people, events, or noting physical characteristics in their natural setting, and observations can be overt, or subjects know they are being observed, or covert, they do not know they are being watched. We have two types of observations. A direct observation that makes you see or listen to everything that happens in the area of observation. For instance, things happening in a classroom, court trial, street trafficking, and the like come directly to your senses. And to avoid waste of energy, time, and effort in observing, you have to stick to the questions that your research aims at answering. And what you ought to focus your attention to during the observation is specified by your research problems. For the indirect observation, the results of an interaction, process, or behavior observed, for example, measuring the amount of plate waste left by students in a school cafeteria to determine whether a new food is acceptable to them. The level of observer participation can vary from wholly participant to a non-participant, and the non-participant observer has limited interaction with the people being observed. Observers can collect data through field notes, video, or audio recordings, which can be analyzed using qualitative analytical tools. If you code your observations to exact numerical data, it can be analyzed using a quantitative approach. And one of the main benefits of using wholly or partial participant observation is that the level of immersion and prolonged involvement with participants can lead to a good rapport, thereby encouraging participants to speak up freely. This helps with the rich details of the collected data. The strengths of observation are as follows. Due to distinguished form of observation, behavior is naturally studied and data is not distorted. The subjects behave in the desired natural manner and do not get influenced by what the observer wants to listen. Observation techniques are cost-effective and produce valid results, and people are observed and their willingness to participate is not taken into account, as in case of focus group discussions or personal interviews. For the weaknesses, it is time-consuming and may involve large amount of inactivity. Observations may lack depth and qualitative richness, and if the ethics are not handled well, legal action can be taken. Moving on, what are the data gathering instruments to be used according to research design? The plan on what instrument to use definitely vary to the objectives of the research study. The types of design are factors to decide what data gathering instrument is to be used. The decision to choose the instruments in data gathering is very important. Also, the formulation of the instruments of data collection must be intended to meet the objectives and at the same time respect budgetary and temporal restrictions as well as other equally relevant issues when conducting research. Thus, the discussion is aligning with the process, steps, and guides in formulating qualitative research instruments. For the case studies, you may use observation, interview, survey, and analysis. For the ethnography research design, you may use interviews, participant observation, reflective diaries, and researchers' own introspective accounts. For phenomenological studies, interviews, participant observation, reflective diaries, and researchers' own introspective accounts. Moving on, let's have the formulation of qualitative research instruments. For the qualitative questionnaires, they attempt to elicit more in-depth responses from the respondents. It is designed to find out what has changed as a result of the program, what the mentees have learned, and what they are doing differently. So the following are the guidelines in formulating qualitative questionnaires. First, mention the purpose of conducting qualitative research. It can be in the form of either of these sentences. This study will be on the topic of the reason for conducting this research is. Second guideline, create qualitative statements with a defined objective that can be easily communicated to the target audience. And third, other than the primary qualitative question, you must create sub-questions so that the purpose is executed in a better manner. The main question might be what are the members' experiences in their school research club, for example. You can create sub-questions such as how to do activities help or hamper their class performance. The fourth guideline is to highlight these questions using qualitative words. Start the questions with what or how to make sure the respondents provide details about their feelings. Questions such as what happened can be asked to develop a description of the topic. And the unstructured questionnaires have open-ended questions that elicit answers to explain, reason out, or express the actual written response of the respondents. For the fifth guideline, develop a skeleton to design the primary questions and the sub-questions. For example, primary qualitative research survey question, how do you think? Blank, that is the main topic of research means. Or describe the main topic of research as you've experienced. Sub-question for qualitative research, what? Referring to the characteristic, does blank or the respondent's interest in as a blank or the main topic of research. Here's an example of a qualitative questionnaire. The research titled The Experiences of the Research Club Members. Let me read the questions. What did you gain from your involvement in the program of Research Club? Please be guided on how these questions are formulated. What activities, goals did your club officers assist you with? How often did you meet with them? What, if anything, are you doing differently as a result of your club membership's experience? How could the program be improved? Overall, how effective were the activities of the research club in assisting you achieve new experiences in terms of research? By the way, please don't forget to include the objectives of your research. For this specific example, its main objective is to find out the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of a research club through the experiences shared by the active members of the club. How about for the interview? Again, it is a conversation for gathering information. It involves an interviewer who coordinates the process of the conversation and asks questions, and an interviewee who responds to these questions. So the success of gathering data through interview lies in the readiness of the interviewer to ask and follow up questions. Here are the tips for formulating interview guides for qualitative interviews. Developing interview guides goes hand in hand with reflecting on what you hope to learn. For any research study, you might start with 2 or more research questions and develop interview questions that will elicit information that will help you to examine the research questions posed. Here are a few more issues to think about as you develop an interview guide. First, the relationship of research questions and interview questions. Remember that research questions are usually not the same as interview questions. Of all the theoretical perspectives one might use in a study, phenomenological research questions seem to most closely resemble an interview question. For example, research question, what are women teachers' experiences of anger in school settings? The initial interview question is, think of a time when you experienced anger in a school setting and tell me about that. Second tip, consider the attributes of a population. Questions to do with attributes of a population, example, age, income, educational attainment, number of years of work experience, etc., might be better examined via the use of a cover sheet that the participant completes themselves after an interview has been conducted, as these sorts of questions do not typically generate conversation. Next, consider this tip. Qualitative interviews are useful for eliciting people's descriptions. Descriptions of perceptions, events, experiences, opinions, beliefs, understandings, and so forth are best done by asking questions in a way that elicits stories. That means that you need to avoid asking closed questions that may be answered by yes or no. Work on developing interview questions that elicit stories. Example, use tell me about, tell me how you define. Okay. Next, ask one question at a time. Example, avoid multiple part questions. Avoid asking questions that have a prior assumption embedded in them. For example, a potential answer or what you hope to find. Fourth tip, questions about factors that impact X. Answers provided by interviewees will be their perceptions of factors that impact. That is, what people attribute to be the reason for X. It has long been known that people do not necessarily know everything about themselves or perhaps believe things that are not actually true. Thus, if you want to examine the research questions about what are the factors that impact X, consider what other forms of evidence you might need to gain an understanding of those. Next, knowledge questions. This can sometimes be threatening since people think they are being examined or evaluated in some way. On the other hand, you might want to know what their knowledge is about a topic. If that is the case, you could introduce this topic further using the sample below. So on the screen, tell me what you have noticed about X, what stands out to you with respect to Y. Next, open-ended questions. Think about the formulation of open-ended questions since sometimes these are too broad and participants will need further guidance. It is useful to experiment with different wordings before an interview. Try this out with your friends and family. For example, tell me about your education. May be too broad of a question for a participant to answer. Thus, consider what you want to learn and ask an open-ended question that is focused enough that participants know what you want to learn. For example, if you want to learn about a person's educational history, you could start with, tell me about your high school years. What stands out? And please consider fewer questions. If you have a long list of questions, consider drafting fewer questions with potential probes that get at details. When asking to follow-up questions, the easiest and most effective way to do this is by using the participant's words. For example, okay, you mentioned X, describe an example of how that works. You talk about Y. What usually happens then? If people have already answered the question, you might not have to ask the follow-up questions you have on your interview guide. That is something you will have to judge on a case-by-case basis in the interview. You cannot draft follow-up questions in advance since you don't know what people will say. However, you always remind yourself of the sentence starters above since they focus on what the participants say rather than your interpretation of what they have said. This is an example of an interview guide. Let's say we have this topic, the victims of fire incident. The objective is indicated here. The study aims to find out the survival instinct of the fire victims and followed by open-ended questions like, will you tell us how the fire started? What were you doing when you realized that the fire has started in your house? Will you share to us the difficulties that you experienced while the fire was going on? After you realized that your house was being consumed by fire, what was the first survival action or surviving action that you do? You tell us some of the things that we have to do if fire incident happens to us. Now let's move on to the observation. It is a successful instrument to the extent that it satisfies the research objectives by capturing relevant events and participants along with the constructs of interest. So we have two tools used in conducting the observation. The observation guide and the observation grid. Okay, so for the observation guide, it helps to maintain the observer's focus while also giving the observer scope to reflect on the context associated with each site. The purpose of this observation tool is to remind the observer of the key points of observation as well as the topics of interest associated with each and act as the motivation for a reflexive exercise in which the observer can reflect on his or her own relationship and contribution to the observed at any moment in time. For example, how the observer was affected by the observations. Here's an example of an observation guide. You can see that the research topic is all about the mother-child relationship. Indicate the research objectives, the location, the date, and the time. Okay, and for the instructions to the observer, he has to write down actions he sees and comments that he hears under the following headings. Examples, the usual thing mother and child do together, the way the mother speaks to her child, the way the child responds to his or her mother, the way the mother disciplines or scolds her child, the way the child reacts, the disciplinary action of his or her mother, the way the mother touches her child, the way the child responds to the touch of his or her mother, the way the mother praises her child, and the mood when mother and child is together, and, of course, the observer's reflexive comments. The second tool is the observation grid. As an adjunct to the observation guide, it is recommended that ethnographic researchers also utilize an observation grid. The grid is similar to the guide in that it helps remind the observer of the events and issues of most important. However, unlike the guide, the observation grid is a spreadsheet or log of sorts that enables the observer to record his reflections of observable events in relationship to the constructs of interest. The grid might show, for instance, the relevant constructs or research issues as column headings and the specific foci of observation as rows. Let's take a look at the example of an observation grid. Okay, so this is an observation grid for the classroom settings of grade 11. Indicated is the research objective and the site location. We have also here the date, the start time, the stop time, and the action observed with the following indicators given in this example. After formulating the research instrument, you need to validate such a research instrument. How would you know if your instrument is valid? Well, to answer this question, you have to understand the concept of validity and how it is done in qualitative research as described by Zorabi in 2013. What is validity? It is a matter of trustworthiness, utility, and dependability of the instrumentation and findings of the study. It is concerned with whether your research is believable and true and whether it is evaluating what it is supposed to evaluate. You can validate your research instruments by either of the following types. Content validity. This validity measures adequately and effectively the different elements, skills, and behaviors of your research instrument by the experts in the field of research. Those experts are expected to give comments to revise the unclear and obscure questions. Also, they advise removing the questions that are ineffective and non-functional. Second is the internal validity. It is concerned with producing research findings parallel to reality in which you have to observe and measure what you are supposed to be measured in your study. You can do the internal validity by the following methods. First is triangulation. For you to strengthen the validity of data and findings, you must collect data through several sources, like questionnaires, interviews, and observations. If you gather data through one technique, findings can be questionable, biased, and weak. You can confirm your findings by collecting information from a variety of sources and with a variety of techniques. If you obtain the same results, you can be sure that the data are valid. Next, member checks. In this method, you can confirm and validate the results and interpretations with the help of your participants. You can hand over the results and interpretations of the interviews to confirm the content of what they have stated during the interview process. This way, you can recognize and support the plausibility and truthfulness of the information. Okay. Next is the long-term observation. In this method, repeated observations over an extended period of time are done to enhance the validity of research data and findings. You should try to visit different settings to obtain your intended information, and your observation must continue until satisfied with the data. The fourth method is peer examination. In peer examination, you need to ask several non-participants in the field to review and give comments to the data and findings. However, these peers must be familiar with the participants in your study. There is an assurance that the plausibility of data analysis and interpretations of such peers can greatly contribute to the validity of the research. Next, the fifth method is participatory or collaborative modes of research. You need to involve most of your participants in all phases of inquiry to enhance the validity of the research. Their ideas and views can be constructive and useful. 6. The last method, researcher's bias. It is a fact that you have your own particular values, beliefs, and worldviews as a researcher, but you need to collect, analyze, and interpret data as fair as possible. You need to be explicit, critical, and faithful at different phases of the inquiry process. You must remain as non-judgmental and clear as possible throughout the research process, and you must stick to the ethical rules and principles. Perform the evaluation accurately as possible and report the findings honestly. Again, you must report the findings honestly. The third type of validity is utility criterion. Utility is the degree of usefulness of the findings for administrators, managers, and other stakeholders. The utility criterion tries to generate enough information for the decision makers about the effectiveness and appropriateness of the program. It is clear that if the findings could provide the different stakeholders with proper and ample information, it can be concluded that the utility criterion has been met and you have achieved the validity requirement. And the last type of validity is the external validity that is concerned with the generalizability of the findings. It determines how the findings of your study can be expected to apply to other settings, people, situations, and/or time periods. That's the end of our lesson today. It's been my pleasure teaching you one of the amazing topics of Practical Research 1, and I really hope you learned something from this video lesson. Thank you and may God bless us all. Let's meet again in our next video.